Welcome to the Overton Pod. Hello, Kanthan.
Greetings, John.
How are you doing?
I'm fit and fabulous, and as you can see, short sleeve weather has arrived.
Yes, it's wonderful.
And we're all back into our black T-shirts from our black T-shirts, except the sleeves are slightly shorter.
Yes, no jackets this time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Nice and warm. Welcome to Johannesburg in summer. Actually having this conversation with some people on WhatsApp recently with regards to Joburg and how underrated it is. And I'm more than happy with that because the property prices are low as a result. But it's really a wonderful city. I know, obviously, we've got the decay that's going on because the government hasn't functioned here for about 15 years now. Maybe a little bit longer. I don't know where you would peg that. But overall, as a place to live, if you kind of create your bubble and make it pleasant, really, really lovely city and certainly far cheaper and far less sort of annoyances than a place like Cape Town, in my opinion.
I lived in Cape Town for 7 years. I would never go back to Cape Town.
There you go. There's a ringing endorsement. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, so yeah, that's what's happening. Now that we've done the proper small talk and discussed the weather, what shall we get into this week?
We've got lots of people who wanted you to follow up on your promise to discuss the U.S. presidential elections.
And Trump, I think. There was something on Trump
which is, 3 weeks away from us now? Is that right?
Wow. It's here, hey?
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Mm. It's one of my favorite times of the year, every 4 years, obviously.
Yes.
But I usually stay up on the evening of the election. And because for us, it's about 4 or 5 in the morning when they call it. If they call it, we don't know if that will happen this time around because...
Well, they didn't call it last time because they were so busy trying to find the extra ballots that would put Biden into the presidential seat that it got delayed for quite a while, remember?
And then Fox News randomly just called Arizona for Biden when it didn't seem like Arizona was going Biden's way.
But they had inside information on Maricopa. Yeah, so.
Right. All right.
It's all good. Uh-huh.
So let's get first into what's been happening in the campaigns there recently. So Trump is doing what he usually does and has done over all of his sort of presidential politics, which is now a long time, from 2015 onwards. So we're talking almost 10 years now. And that is essentially he goes around, he does rallies, mainly. He does some sort of what they'd call retail politics in the US, which is where you go to a small town or a fair or a shop or a donut store, for example, and you sort of make nice with the people. And he does a little bit of that, which all the politicians do. And then he does these big rallies.
No, actually, Harris doesn't.
Okay,
so let's be clear.
We'll get to good old Kamala. You're not allowed to call her Kamala because it's racist. So Kamala, which I can't actually say because of my accent. It's quite difficult to say Kamala, but I will do my best. So he does that, and he does these rallies, and those have been somewhat curtailed a little bit because of security arrangements now, because apparently people are trying to kill him, and. He did a big one the other day. He went back to the place where they tried to assassinate him. I say they, according to the official story, a lone shooter tried to assassinate him. If you buy that, if you don't, then they tried to assassinate him.
Well, we did do a substantial podcast on that, and we can just refer people back to that.
We're not going to get back into that. And he did a big rally, quite impressive. Then you had Elon Musk coming up on stage. Elon Musk is now fully endorsing Trump in more than just endorsing, I think.
Well, if you see the threats that have been coming in the direction of Twitter in particular, and the broad range of Musk companies in general, from the deep state establishment, it's very clear that this is, for Musk, more than just a question of wanting to support his favorite team. This is very much an existential threat against his entire operations.
And him, potentially, because he might go to prison.
Yes.
If you know, I mean, they want to send Trump. They convicted him, as we are reminded by MSDNC. They convicted him as a felon for a bookkeeping error. 34 felonies, in fact, for one singular bookkeeping error.
Well, it wasn't his bookkeeping error either. It was the error of his accountant.
Sure. but that's what they did. So if they can do that to Trump, I'm sure they can find a mistake that Elon has made along the way. Certainly someone like Elon, who, as we know, is, well, I'm sure a psychiatrist would say, autistic. And so chances are there's plenty of errors you can apply a law to somewhere along the way. Show me the man and I'll show you the law. Isn't that the famous Soviet Union refrain? So that's what Trump's been doing. Polling is interesting because I'm interested to hear what you think about polling.
If you just simply take a look at all of the drone shots of all of Trump's rallies, and you look at literally hundreds of thousands of people that are turning out in these rallies, I mean, they are literally lining the streets when his motorcades go past. You don't see a single one of those things happening for Kamala Harris.
No,
Not one. Not one.
You don't.
And when she does pitch up at these very carefully choreographed events, they're always very careful to show it, show the stage from the front. There's no shots in terms of the purported audiences that turn out for these.
So I did see one. I saw a few. Look, the crowd sizes arguments. I think people get very upset at the beginning of this campaign season. Not this campaign season, but certainly this campaign season is actually only 2 months old because Kamala is has only been the nominee for since July 20 something. I don't remember the exact date, but somewhere around there.
Well, she was raised in a middle class family, so
yeah. So we're going on to sort of 2.5 months of Kamala being the nominee. So this campaign season really is only 2.5 months long, which is incredibly short for a presidential campaign. Usually they're ridiculously long, 2 years, and by the time primaries are decided.
Perspective, she's been part of the campaign trail for more than a year, except she was part of the campaign trail as the VP candidate rather than as the presidential candidate.
Absolutely.
And so it's not as though she hasn't had every opportunity over more than a year going back for her to be actually putting her stamp in terms of what she stands for, which we still don't know, and what she's going to do, which we still don't know, and why she's not able to do those things right now when it's very clear that Biden is pretty much falling down asleep most of the time or passed out on the beach and or just basically losing his temper.
Yeah, so all of those things. I think what I'm getting at with the length of the campaign is it's difficult to... In terms of saying, oh, well, she's had 300 rallies. She hasn't, because there literally hasn't been the time to do that. Oh, she's had 400 campaign stops, which these numbers are kind of normal in a presidential campaign. She hasn't, because they're literally, even if she'd wanted to, she's purposefully also not done many in the time that she's had, but she hasn't even done the volumes. But what I did notice at one of the campaigns, because the crowd numbers were argued at the beginning, and Trump gets quite animated about this topic, and people get very upset about him getting animated. And I don't understand why people get upset about that, because if you lie about silly things like crowd sizes, which they always claim he lies about, when in fact the other side does it all the time, then you'd probably lie about most things. But what I did see where was interesting is in sort of pushback, I suppose, or just showing how popular she is. There was a rally recently that she did. I don't remember exactly. I think it was one of the Sunbelt states, Arizona, Nevada, somewhere there. Might have been Georgia. But the point is she did a rally, and they showed a photo with a lot of people. And they said that there were 4,000 people or something there.
Yes, and the same people seem to be sitting in various parts of the audience.
This is what is fascinating. So someone is tracking the IP pings coming off the cell phones at these rallies. And then they are comparing those IP addresses to the IP addresses coming off the next rally, and so on and so forth. And what they found is that up to 90% of those pings are identical between her rallies, which suggests that the crowd is a renter crowd for the most part, and that they're moving with her as like a touring group, like groupies.
So we're talking about two separate things. I'm talking about the fact that when you zoom in on the crowds at these rallies, and left-hand side of the screen, you'll see exactly the same group of people that are on the right-hand side of the screen, which leads everyone to the conclusion that these have been doctored, these pictures.
Right. Okay. But then I'm going to say, for those listening who, and I do hope we have some people listening who sort of shout at the screen occasionally, or at their phone or whatever they listen to us on, and say, oh, no, you guys are wrong, and they disagree with us. They're on the opposite side of things. They think Trump's an existential threat to democracy or some such narrative, and that Kamala is amazing, which, I mean, we all don't even know how to say her name properly, let's be honest. That's how amazing she is. We didn't even notice her for several years. I mean, I noticed her as probably the worst VP in history. Dick Cheney comes close, but she's probably the worst in history. And she has that's definitely fines at the end of the year, hey? Phone on. Right, so the thing is that the polls don't show what you're saying. And let me clarify that. Let me flesh that out. What the polls are showing and saying is that they're neck and neck. Okay, and in fact, that's an updated. So as of today and the last week, they're neck and neck. And in fact, up until before a week ago, Kamala was leading in every place she needed to lead. So obviously, Trump will win Texas and Kamala will win California. But in the places that are needed, we're talking about Georgia, we're talking about Arizona, we're talking about Nevada, we're talking about Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Okay, and those are really the places that are mostly up for grabs. Ohio, maybe, but probably going to Trump. North Carolina now potentially up in the air, but after the hurricane. So look, even in those areas, you still have Kamala in the lead up until about a week ago. Now it's neck and neck, according to everyone. Now, the problem with this is that people are not sure what to make of polls. We know that in 2016, they said Hillary Clinton had a 98% chance of winning, and that she was going to win, in fact, and she didn't.
So you clearly don't believe that, in fact, she won the election and that Trump stole it with Russian interference.
Well, that's her claim. She was, as per Democrat talking point narrative, Hillary Clinton is an election denier who is a threat to democracy. I don't make the rules. So, if you want to buy into that kind of narrative, then that's what Hillary Clinton is. Then in 2020... okay, a bit of a different situation because you had COVID on the go. Polling did show Joe Biden winning, and then Joe Biden won. And I think there was some sort of reinvigoration of polling that happened because in 2016, they obviously got it completely wrong. Or did they? And then in 2020, Joe Biden won and they sort of got it right. And so the real question is these polls don't seem to make sense to a lot of people who look at what you're pointing out, which is roads lined with Trump supporters, sort of these stadiums. He goes back to Butler, Pennsylvania, where the assassination attempt occurred, and he has tens of thousands of people cheering for him. And Butler, by the way, is not a city. It's a town.
Yes.
And most of the people who would have been at that rally were not, in fact, residents of Butler. There would have been a lot of residents of Butler, but not that. There's not that many people in Butler. A lot of those people would have driven from other areas in Pennsylvania. And so you see these kinds of crowds, and then you see the Kamala sort of situation. You see Trump going and doing the retail politics and kind of being mobbed. You see Kamala trying to do similar things at the spice shop in DC, for example, and nobody really cares. It's very choreographed and coordinated. Trump walks into a burger store and buys all the employees food and all the supporters food, and it's very sort of or it looks natural, put it that way. And so the polling seems weird. And what do you make of all of that?
So I don't trust the polls. So the reason why I don't trust the polls is for this very simple reason that would you trust someone who calls you and asks you whether you support Trump? because that means that you're likely to be put on a particular hit list for for people. No, frankly, it's the number of people who are actually willing to speak up in public and to say that they support Donald Trump is actually few and far between. And nearly all of these polls are conducted either by the internet or by telephone. And generally what it assumes that the people who are going to pick up the phone and actually give you an opinion are people who actually have the inclination and the time to do so. So what we can certainly say is that the majority of your blue-collar workers in the United States have neither the inclination nor the time to be talking to pollsters. The laptop class, on the other hand, have lots of time on their hands, and they are more than willing to speak about the fact that they think that Kamala Harris is actually fabulous, in spite of the fact that they're not able to name a single thing that she stands for. So that's why I don't trust the polls. And I've said for years, the only poll that really matters is the actual poll that takes place on election day. And in fact, it turns out, even more so than those actual polls, is that it then turns out to be the extent to which additional votes get found at the last minute that can't actually be tracked back and authenticated.
Okay, so let's get into I'm sure this will be demonetized. I mean, we're not monetized on YouTube, but I wonder if we'll get a strike for this. But we're going to have this conversation because I don't care.
Well, we got a strike last week.
It wasn't a formal strike. Just to explain what happened, we had a conversation, and it was a really good episode. The views are showing us down, but I can tell you that that's been manipulated, because on my dashboard on YouTube, when I uploaded the episode, within the first 12 hours or something, there were 674 views or something. So it showed something to that effect. And then that usually obviously rises. Most episodes have been getting around 3,000 at the moment. But what then happened was it didn't rise. It then dropped to 500. It then got flagged with a note on the show which said something about climate change, because we spoke about nuclear energy.
And we didn't speak about climate change.
We didn't really talk about climate change. We might have mentioned it as in passing, as in, if you're worried about that as a specific thing, maybe, nuclear should be a part of it. I'm sure we're going to get slapped on this podcast again. I don't care. I really couldn't give a shit, but and which is why I'll talk about the election stuff as well, because we're having a conversation. This is information, and you can choose to take it, not take it. You can fact check it all you like. You can go check the parts that we were wrong about, right about, etc. That's how.
And in fact, we encourage people to do that, because, if you're able to turn around and say to either one of us, "Hey, there's something that you've said that's actually wrong," flag it in those comments, and of course we're going to respond to it.
Absolutely. And obviously there's debate about all this stuff, and I do think where possible we have our opinions, but we try to sort of take in most of the facts as far as we can. So anyway, that show got kind of flagged and then deboosted, and has it looks quite funny, because it looks like we were sort of had a consistent number of views, and then suddenly that show is like all the way down. So in my opinion, it's been completely manipulated. And in fact, I can see on the downloads of podcasts that didn't change. That went up slightly. So there must have been manipulation on YouTube's part. Anyway, be it as may, we know that that's how YouTube functions. So with regards to the elections, I think on the polls, I agree with part of what you're saying. People don't necessarily say, yes, full-throated support for Trump, although I think that might have changed a little bit this election. You look at who's endorsing Trump. You've got the likes of Elon Musk. You've got a lot of Silicon Valley people. You've got a fair number of relatively high-profile businessmen. Hell, you've even got the head of the unions. One of the largest unions in the United States, sort of going and speaking in the Republican National Convention. Now, he hasn't specifically endorsed Trump, but they also have not endorsed Kamala, which is the first time they have not endorsed the Democratic candidate in, I think, 40 years. So that is quite something. And so I do think it's becoming a little bit more mainstream to be able to say, look, I'm a Trump supporter. I like what the guy did. yeah, mean tweets aside, you know, you don't like his personality, you wouldn't want to be his wife, all good. Fully understand all of those positions.
Actually, there's a number of people who would love to be his wife.
I'm sure. I have no doubt about it. But you get the usual sensibilities. And maybe we should get into some of those things a little bit later. But I think, so perhaps, but there is certainly some concern, I guess, if you get a phone call and you say, and you get asked, who do you support? You may not say Trump. Fine. That may be affecting the polling.
So that's part one. But the bigger thing that we need to take into account, John, is the sample size in terms of these polls. So one of the more, shall we say, consistently accurate polls is done by Rasmussen reports. I don't know if you've come across them.
Yeah, Rasmussen, although they are on the right.
Yeah, well, no, but I'd like to think of them as actually being fairly centrist. Okay, because unlike the polls that get done by the very obviously left-wing sources, Rasmussen reports does show Kamala Harris is ahead of Trump or Kamala Harris is behind Trump. But the crucial thing is to remember that these are overnight telephone polls, and the sample size is less than 500. So it's between 450 to 500 people that get called on a daily basis. And based on the responses that they get to those calls, so it depends on A, the person's going to pick up the phone, B, the person's going to be willing to talk to you, C, the person's going to be willing to express an opinion that's actually correct and accurate. You're not going to be getting a good sample. But what becomes very interesting that you should take a look at in terms of these polls is when these polls are conducted on a daily basis, which they are, then you need to look at the overall moving average, because that's going to give you a far more accurate indication of what the trends are. And, you should be applying that in just about anything. So if we look at the stock market, for example, we wouldn't use whatever is happening on the stock market today as an indication of the overall performance. Just as an example. Yes. Yesterday, the Nasdaq went down by 1.5%. Today, it reversed those and went up, quite splendidly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you need to track.
So let me push back a little bit on that because Newsweek reported, and I'm cheating here with a little bit of googling, which I don't usually do, but I think it's important to give as balanced a view on this as possible.
Oh, you trust Google, do you?
No, I don't, and I'm gonna tell you what Google ranked first as the first result when I looked for the most reliable polling on the US election, which I did on purpose because I knew Google would give me a left-wing view, but it then came up with a Newsweek article as the first hit. Which was put up 21 hours ago, so yesterday essentially. And that says that the latest New York Times and Siena College poll, now Siena College has been doing polling through a number of US elections and kind of partners with the New York Times, I guess, who publishes the poll and probably funds some of it, says that Harris is beating Trump for the first time, according to their poll, for the first time since July, and she's beating him by 3 points, 47 to 44, with a margin of error of 2.4. And
what's the sample size?
So the sample size on that is 3,385 likely voters, right? Which is what I want to get into because I think that that's quite important. I also want to just point out that 538, which is I forget his name. The 538 polls are run by. I forget the guy, but former sort of Democrats. He's kind of a independent. He runs 538, and he combines polls. So he takes he ranks polls according to what's most reliable in his opinion, according to certain factors. And they grade the polls, and then they'll take all the polls, but obviously the best ones, according to the grading, have a higher weighting. And he currently sort of says Harris leads Trump as well. So that's where we are as of today. But it's interesting to me that the Siena poll, allegedly since July, hasn't had her leading Trump, either tied or Trump leading. Fine. It's also interesting to me that that's where they say she is now, given what's happened in the past couple of weeks, which I want to get into later. So we have that in terms of the polls, and I want to talk about sample size because you've mentioned it repeatedly. So it's who you sample is one thing, which you've spoken about. The other side is sample size. So to extrapolate in statistics, to extrapolate a poll where there are two choices, you need roughly 1,000 people. It depends on how you model that, but with the stats, and your maths and stats are better than mine, but with the stats, roughly you need somewhere around 1,000 people. Sometimes it'll come 1,100, 1,200. Sometimes it'll come to 900, depending on population size. But that's what you need to poll, in theory, to get an accurate polling a number with a reasonable margin of error. The problem obviously comes down to a few things. America is probably 170 million voters that are going to vote in this election, somewhere around there, 160.
Although there were more voters who voted for Joe Biden last time round than there were actual registered voters in those areas. So,
yes.
So let's put that aside.
Let's put that aside because it's a contentious issue. But you're going to have probably, Biden allegedly got 81 million votes. I think Trump got 79 million. I think that was the number, roughly. So you're talking about 160 million people, and you can imagine that in theory the population has grown a little bit. So you're going to have somewhere between 160 and 170 million votes. Fine. Now, when you poll 1,000 people or 3,000 people, and then you extrapolate that, you can see where the problems might come in. Because, and especially in a country like America, which is so diverse in terms of the way it is as a country, how each state differs in their cultures almost. If you visited America, you will find that, yes, the South is the South. And if you go to Tennessee or Louisiana, you might find they're quite similar. But you will not find a lot of similarities between the people in Tennessee and New York, for example, or Florida or California necessarily. They're all American and they all think certain things and they all behave in certain ways that are similar, but there are definitely differences. And so when you poll using 1,000 or 3,000 or even 5,000 or 10,000 people, and you try extrapolate that, even though the statistics in mathematics do function, you may not be getting the right answer.
I don't particularly want us to spend too much time on the intricacies of polling. Frankly, I think even a sample size of 1,000 is way too small. I'm more inclined to say we need to focus, excuse me. Oh my goodness. We need to focus our attention on the swing states, because that's
Yes,
that's
right.
the only thing that matters.
This is what I want. This is what I want to
So
drill down to.
we need people to understand that there are. So the elections in the United States get decided by an electoral college system, and the way in which the electoral college system works is that each of the states are assigned a number of electoral votes that is directly based on the proportion of voters that reside within that particular state. Mm-hmm. And some states are not in dispute. So we're very clear that California is going to go to the Democrats, and we're very clear that Florida is going to go to the Republicans.
Right, and the reason why that website is called 538, Silver, I think his
Yes.
name is, the reason why it's called that is because there are 538 electoral votes.
Yes.
And you need 270 to win the presidency.
To win, correct, yes.
So, yes, and you're absolutely right. So the so-called the Electoral College is what decides it. That's why the popular vote is completely irrelevant and will remain unless America decides to abolish the Electoral College, because America is actually not a democracy, it's a republic. And that's how it works, to make sure that every state, as part of the union of those states, the United States, gets an equal say in who leads them federally as the head of the government. And that's why they have the Electoral College.
Well, so the equal say, let's be very clear about this. The equal say is certainly at the level of the Senate.
Yes.
But it's not at the level in terms of the House of Representatives, which gets seats allocated based on
population. So that's
based on
popular
population.
vote.
So that's very much a popular vote scenario. But I think the crucial thing that we need to get people to understand is that the elections ultimately get decided by who is able to take these handful of swing states.
Right. So let's go down to that. So the polling, even if it's completely accurate, even if Kamala, let's say they say 47 to 44 for Trump, so take that 3% difference. And again, let's say she gets 81 million votes and Trump gets 79, there will be your difference. But he still wins. Or vice versa. He gets 81 million votes, she gets 79, but she still wins.
Yes.
That will come down to the swing states. And that's because certain states are already in the bag for certain candidates or are assumed to be. So the exceptions would be an election of someone like Reagan, who won pretty much all of the states, except I think Minnesota and Rhode Island, I think. I stand to be corrected. That's coming from memory. But generally, you have Democrat states and you have Republican states. So California is going to vote Democrat. Those electoral college votes will go to Kamala Harris. And Florida, Texas, for example, are highly likely. Florida used to be up in the air, but probably isn't anymore. Those states are likely to go to Trump. And so those votes are in his bag, so to speak. But these other states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Georgia, and Arizona, those states.
Yeah, in terms of sheer volumes, it's really the first of that lot that really matter. So Pennsylvania definitely.
I think
matters.
Pennsylvania is going to be the big one.
Yes,
it's 19 electoral votes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's quite a populist state, and so it gets a lot of electoral votes. And yeah, so that's where it's going to matter. Now, this is the crux of this. Your polling may be absolutely correct. Your polling in the state may even be absolutely correct. The problem is that the difference, the margins are tiny. So you're looking at somewhere like Wisconsin. I think Biden took Wisconsin last time from Trump, if I'm not mistaken, by something like 25,000 votes. Right, I think he took Michigan by something like 40,000 votes. Now, again, I might be getting these numbers slightly off, but I'm not. They're not giantly off. So it wasn't hundreds of thousands of votes. And when Trump beat Hillary, he did the same thing. It's funny how we call the women by first names and the men by surnames. Maybe I should just do surnames for everyone. But when Trump beat Hillary Clinton, he also beat her by small margins in a lot of these swing states. That's generally what happens. That's why they're called swing states, because they can swing either way. And often the traditional idea, the traditional knowledge has been, well, you're going to win the swing state based on turnout.
So, but the crucial thing to understand in terms of these swing states, and ultimately these swing states then get decided based on the city votes in the big cities. So up until the very last minute, certainly in terms of Pennsylvania and in terms of Wisconsin, Trump was clearly ahead of the game right up until the very last minute, until votes came in from the big cities. And the interesting thing now in terms of these big cities is, and most people don't understand this, is that unlike the situation that we have in our country, where we have an independent electoral commission that actually oversees the electoral process, checks your IDs, checks it off against a voter's roll, does all of those good things.
Yeah.
The U.S. doesn't do that.
Yes.
So the U.S. works on the assumption that the responsibility for managing elections is carried out at a county level.
Correct.
And in terms of the way in which that works, there is no possibility of an outside body coming in to oversee that process in terms of what happens at the county level. So if the county takes responsibility for issuing a set of results, and they have decided that they are basing that set of results on counting that was done by whatever process fits in with the rules of that county, there is no recourse in terms of appealing to a higher authority other than trying to interrogate it at the level of that county.
Yeah.
Now, the counties that actually ended up turning those votes in for Biden that gave him the election last time have a combination of a couple of things. Okay, they have they Democrat-run counties, and they have a history of corruption and absolute lack of service delivery. So when you combine those two, my take on it is there any possibility that the people who are responsible for managing those results are playing by the rules? Well, I don't know. We leave that as an exercise.
Let's
we leave that as an exercise for the audience.
Let's interrogate the what you've explained a little bit further, because I think America has always been seen as this great democracy, even been called that sometimes. And everyone just assumed that, they do democracy the best because they're the biggest and, they're America. And for a lot of South Africans, where we have the Independent Electoral Commission, and it's weird because Americans federalize everything else. So law enforcement, yes, there's different police services in different counties and different states. But at the end of the day, then you have the FBI, right? And so if you commit crimes across multiple states, that becomes an FBI issue. If it's a broader crime, it may even just become an FBI issue. If it's a large crime, it may become an FBI issue. If it's organized crime, etc. So, a lot of the stuff gets taken away from the ground level stuff up to the national level. Department of Homeland Security. So you can go to an airport, even a small airport, in any state you like, and there's a federal agency to run the airport security, right?
But remember, that only was the case post 9/11.
Yes, post 9/11, right?
Yes.
But in the one area you think they should really have one way of doing things, which is elections. Everyone should vote in the exact same. I don't think that's a limitation on freedom.
But this is now to Elon Musk's point, which and again this comes back to the question of who is going to end up winning this. And no one right now is currently polling the
enough out of the margin.
The millions of illegal immigrants that have been tracked into the country.
Yeah.
And are these millions of illegal immigrants going to be in a position to vote?
Okay, but I want to explain to people, because listeners are going right now, and some of them might be thinking, you're out of your mind. How would they go about doing that? And so that's why I wanted to drill down in what you meant about all the county stuff.
So if your county allows you to pitch up and vote at an election without having ID.
Yes, which many do. Many do.
Which basically means you just stand in line and you go and you take a ballot and you cast a vote and you stick it into the ballot box, and then you pull a lever on the Dominion voting machine and you go your way.
Okay, so some places do ask for ID, some don't.
Correct.
Some places have paper ballots, some don't. Some places have machines, some don't. Some places allow you to mail in your ballot from a residential address where you've just received empty ballots, and then you put it in a mailbox, and some don't. Some places allow you to have these giant things called drop boxes, which is a mailbox just for ballots, unmonitored, unchecked, right?
Correct,
and then once it's full, it gets sealed up and delivered to the counting station and on election
But it's even more complicated than that, because if you take a look at Maricopa County in Arizona, which is one of the areas that was most in dispute. Mm-hmm. Right now, Maricopa County requires voter ID if you're voting in state elections or local elections. It does not require voter ID for voting in the presidential elections.
Yeah.
So explain the discrepancy in ways that a 5-year-old could understand. You can't.
No.
Because clearly the motivation in this case is to allow for manipulation of the ballot in favor of a particular candidate.
Yeah.
And so this is clearly going to be the case.
The question that always gets asked, which cannot be answered, and I'll give the answer the Democrats do give, but the question is, why wouldn't you want people to have ID when they vote? Why wouldn't you be able to identify? So those who are not South African, who are listening to this, when we vote, we have to register at a specific place long before. In fact, months before, if not years. And then you can only really vote there. You can move around, but you have to be specifically notified. And there's a whole process, right? So it's very onerous. So we usually just register at one place. That's usually a school near our house or a church or something like that. On the day of voting, which is only one day, so we don't vote by mail 3 months before. If you propose mail-in voting to a South African, they would laugh at you in your face. It's preposterous. And most of the world sees that as preposterous. So we go on the day, we walk in, we present.
Although in all fairness, we don't have a postal system.
We don't. But even if we had a beautiful postal system, we once did have a great post office, and they worked really, really well. And I still wouldn't have trusted them with election ballots. So we go there, we give them an ID. They then check our ID against the register. If your name is not on the register for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. You're not getting to vote that day. What then happens is they physically cross your name out on the register, and they stain your finger with a indelible ink. And that is the right word, eh?
That is the correct word, yes.
Thank you. And they stain your finger, and then you take a paper ballot or several paper ballots, because there may be different things to vote on, and you go and mark them, and then you put them in a giant cardboard box, which is being watched by...
Well, a series of cardboard boxes, because
Sure.
you'd have one for national, one for
Yeah,
provincial.
and these are all being watched not only by the people employed by this federal agency called the Independent
But you
Electoral
also have
Commission,
party election
but you also
observers.
have party observers watching you from different parties who obviously it's in their interest to make sure nobody plays around or fiddles around. So the chance of being able to cheat, obviously it's possible.
Yes, but it's minimized.
But it's very difficult. It's really hard in our context. So when I look at the US elections and I say, why wouldn't you want people to have ID to vote? And the only answer that gets given by the Democrats, or was at least in the last election, is it's racist to require people to vote. Now, I live in a country where the majority of people are black. And the majority of people who vote are black. And they manage just fine. Why on earth is it racist to want people to present ID to vote? It's just an insane thought. And of course, the next argument is, well, it's hard for minorities to get IDs, but that is not proven. There's no evidence
Except
for that.
we had this COVID lockdown, and during that time it was impossible for you to do anything if you didn't actually have access to an ID. You might remember this.
Yes, I do. So,
And as things stand right now, you need an ID to be able to open a bank account. You need an ID to be able to buy yourself a drink.
Yes, absolutely. So you even in the United States, these are simple things. If you want to buy a drink and you look particularly young, they will ask you to make sure you're 21. You want to go into a casino, they will make sure you're over the age of, I think it's 18. If you want to buy a car, if you want to buy a house, if you want to open a bank account, if you want to do any of these things, in those areas, it works exactly the same as the rest of the world. You need some form of identification. In elections, in many states, you don't need an ID. Now, what Elon Musk has said is that the reason that exists is the only reason that would exist is because you want to cheat. And the secondary part to that is who doesn't often have an ID and would normally not be allowed to vote? Well, people who aren't citizens. And that's what he's claiming. And he's saying you've got a whole bunch of these swing states in which illegal immigrants have been shipped in. The big argument between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and the argument between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz at their debate around illegal immigrants. They fact-checked J.D. Vance on people being illegal immigrants, and he fact-checked them back because what they've done is the Biden administration has created a loophole which shouldn't exist. So I can go now and download something called the CBP One app. It's available on the App Store. And I can ask for asylum or refugee status in the United States. And it will come back to me and likely grant me that status.
Well, it will say that you'll have to appear before a competent authority in something like 3 years' time. And in the meanwhile, you can just kick back and relax.
Yes, but you can be in the United States while that happens, and that's what happened with those Haitian immigrants. That there was all that stuff about eating the cats and eating the dogs of the people who lived there. A great song by the Kifness. It gets stuck in your head, but that's what's really occurred is those people are there according to Democrats legally, but because Biden and Harris made this app that you can apply on and wait for a hearing date, which will be 3 to 5 years down the line, and be there, inverted commas, legally. But it's very clearly facilitated illegal immigration. That's all it is. It's government-facilitated illegal immigration.
So in fact, that's just sleight of hand, because what they are in fact saying is that not that you are a legal immigrant, but that your illegal entry into the country has been documented with a view to eventually processing you.
Yes.
But it does not make you a legal immigrant.
And look, there's a good track record for that because you can go back to Obama, who talked about the dreamers.
Yes.
And what is a dreamer? It's always language. The left loves using bastardizing language. What is a dreamer? It's a person whose parents came to the country illegally, were not meant to be in the country, are still not meant to be in the country, and had a child. And those children didn't have citizenship because they weren't properly registered, and are now sort of floating around the population as illegals themselves, but they're not immigrants, they're native born. And so they're about, I think at the time that Obama wanted to naturalize these people, there were 11 million, I think, of those people. And he wanted to naturalize the dreamers. And so this is, you're not speaking out of something that doesn't occur. What ultimately happens is these people hang around for 5, 10, 15, 20, then 30 years. And then you go, well, they've been here for 30 years, so we should allow them to be American citizens, even though they never came here legally. And then you can potentially shift entire voting demographics and change swing states.
Which is in fact exactly what has happened, because, I remember growing up, so over the course of my lifetime, so remember that California used to be Republican, and Ronald Reagan was governor of California.
Yeah.
And Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor of California, and he was a Republican.
Yeah.
And, we're talking over...
Although he was an exception. California was already quite blue. The colors are interesting too, but California was already quite blue in terms of Democrat by the time Arnold got into power. The reason why he got into power was because of his fame. He had a lot of that as backing, and people also knew he may have been on a Republican ticket, but he was the most moderate of moderate Republicans. And in fact, if you look at the Republicans in California, which is something I actually want to discuss, but let you finish your point, and then we'll talk about the Republicans in California.
So, but the crucial thing is that it was possible for a Republican to win California, and it's no longer the case.
Well, and not only that, if you look even in their state houses.
Yes, but the reason why it's no longer the case is precisely because of the fact that you had people who were bussed into these states and made part of the voting populace, so that it now becomes damn near impossible to ever swing those states back again.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you have states like Texas, for example, which are taking very deliberate steps to prevent that situation happening. Because you have the capital of Texas, for example, Austin, which is a Democrat city. It's a Democrat city, and again, attracts exactly the same type of scenario that you have in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and so forth. And you have to actually take steps at a state level to ensure that you're not going to have the integrity of the state's voting system compromised just simply because of the fact that you've been able to bring in an extraordinary number of people into a single city. And it's a fascinating phenomenon for a couple of levels, because there are lots of Democrats who are fleeing Democrat states because they're horribly run and their cities are crime-ridden. And they flee to Republican states, but then they bring their voting patterns with them.
Yeah, they still vote Democrats.
And they vote to bring back the same bad policies that made them flee in the first place.
Yeah. All right. So that's just I think, if you aren't aware, I think a lot of our viewers and listeners will be aware of those sort of problems in the American elections.
So, but the crucial thing that I need to say from my perspective is that it's impossible to make a call on this election because the elections are not free and fair in the US.
Yeah. So this
and if you use that as
right, so you've
as
made it 40 minutes into the podcast,
yes,
and you've got basically both of our predictions. And I predicted Trump's victory in 2016. A lot has changed since then. And he was an anomaly. He was not meant to win. And when I say he was not meant to win, the system truly didn't believe he was going to win. Whatever you view the system as, but the mainstream media didn't think he was going to win. What's often referred to as the deep state. So these are people who've been in power in very powerful institutions like the Pentagon, like the FBI, like the CIA, like Department of Homeland Security, etc. The State Department. These are people who've some of them have worked there for 40 years, their entire lives. They didn't think Trump would win. It wasn't even a worry. And then because of how things function in these swing states with these small margins where you win by a relatively small margin, he did. And then we had the shenanigans in 2020, and that was really a mail-in election because COVID enabled a lot of changes in laws. And there were a number of states, and most of the swing states that ended up going to Biden were states where the laws had been changed to allow for this mail-in voting. They changed it. They meant to have something called signature verification. So if you do mail-in ballot, there are meant to be ways to sort of see that it was in fact you that completed the ballot.
And that was tossed out.
And in many states, for example, Arizona, a lot of the signature verification simply didn't occur. So they didn't know, you couldn't prove that maybe that was a legitimate ballot, maybe it wasn't. No one checked, right? And so when there are questions about the election integrity, that's important. Those things are important. And I agree with you. I would say that it is impossible to predict who's going to win this. I'll tell you what should happen. We maybe get into that as at the end, what should happen. But it is impossible to predict whether Trump or Harris will win. And the reason for that is they do not have free and fair elections. What I did want to say, though, is that Elon Musk has been quite clear that he views this election as, and other people have too. Elon's obviously a big voice. But other people have said similar things where they call this, the most important election. Democracy's on the line. That's the Democrats' line. But the Republicans equally say, that the America is going to be destroyed if the Democrats get another 4 years, if Kamala wins. So that's the rhetoric. Elon says, look, what's going to happen if they win is that they're going to basically cement all these illegals as citizens ultimately, and that will change the demographics of the swing states forever, and so everything will just be Democrat. And I'm going to say that I agree with that, but there's a bit of pushback to say, and it comes back to those California Republicans. If you compare a California Republican to a Texas Republican, they do not resemble each other. In fact, a California Republican, a state representative, for example, state house representative in the California legislature, could very easily run as a Democrat in Texas because the Texas Democrats resemble Republicans in California.
Yeah, but I think that's too much nuance for us to drill into because
what I just want to say is that it's not about. I think it's important. It's a bugbear of our elections, which is that people don't understand ideology. And so because we never vote on ideology, essentially, most people, I do, but most people don't. And so they'll vote on issue, or they'll vote on which party they seem to like or which leader they like. They don't vote on ideology. And in America, there is a lot of actual voting on ideology because Republicans know what they stand for very often, and Democrats know what they stand for. And so people do vote on ideological lines. However, what happens is even if, let's say, they come in and all those illegals become citizens or are able to vote, or they change the voting and they manipulate, whatever ends up happening, and you have this situation where now all these swing states are just Democrat states. all that will happen is it doesn't mean the end of the Republicans or the GOP. It just means the GOP will be pulled to the left. In the same way as we see the DA being pulled to the left. So they're meant to be a centrist party, but they're now in government with the ANC. They've got to kind of make nice. And so what big stuff have they done so far? Well, they've met with the Chinese and given them tons of praise. All right, and they've pulled back on their criticism of NHI, and they've kind of gone ahead with other policy decisions of the ANC, which are left-wing, socialist, sometimes communist even policy. And so, unfortunately,
you see, I don't share your
Musk
view
is
at all,
wrong.
because I think what's likely to happen in the US this time round is that you're far more likely to actually have a fragmenting of the union for the first time.
I'm not saying that won't happen.
Yeah, and I'm not talking at the level of physical insurrection. I'm talking about states actually opting to leave the union.
Yeah, they might opt out. So, give you an idea. If Texas opted out,
Yes.
Texas would be, I think it'd be in the top 20 economies in the world.
Correct. Yes.
And in terms of GDP, and it would be, I saw numbers on this. It's quite incredible, put it that way. California equally is also an incredible, It's a powerhouse. California would also, if it were to leave the union, it wouldn't under those circumstances. What I will say, though, is, a Michael Malice line, which is that conservatism is just liberalism going at the speed limit. All right. And so, if you take a big topic in this election like abortion, 40 years ago, the Republicans were completely against abortion, no doubts about it, on all fronts, before Reagan, essentially, just before Reagan. It was a non-negotiable, okay? The Democrats were for abortion, but they were for abortion in the same way the Europeans are for abortion. 12 to 16 weeks, and then you're kind of going to have a baby. That's how this works.
Yes.
Now we fast forward 40 years, and the Republicans are, obviously there's still some hardliners, but for the most part on polling, the Republican position on abortion is, look, we don't like it, but we understand it needs to happen, okay, with limitations. Trump's personal position that he stated is the exceptions rule, right? Rape, incest, that kind of stuff.
So I don't think the reason why you are seeing that happening now is as a result of the core Republicans shifting their positions, as much as the fact that a lot of former Democrats have swung across to the Republican side, and they bring with them those particular things. So by the same token, you're likely to find that Republican views towards gay rights, as an example, are significantly less dogmatic than they would have been 20 years ago. And again, I'm saying that it's pretty much for the same reason.
But what all I'm saying is that change happened over time, 4 decades, and now it's seen as almost the position they hold now is almost.
But it's not dissimilar to Elon Musk's own position, because remember that he was pretty much a Democrat for his entire life.
Pretty much, he's voted in all elections. He's voted in
up until fairly recently.
Yes.
And the reason why he's now voting Republican is not because of the fact that he supports the Republican position on abortion, or that he supports the Republican.
He thinks there's more important things than abortion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And I do want to get into that, but what all I'm saying is that countries move with the general population. So politicians are just are informed by what the population is thinking and saying. So, for example, in South Africa, we have a population who, says stuff about land, for example. They're a vocal minority, in fairness, but it's an issue because we have that issue. It wasn't an issue. It wasn't even barely spoken about 20 years ago. In America, same thing on the abortion, for example. Things move. And so all I think that would happen with integrating the illegals into their voting system is that they'd become Democrats for 2 cycles. The whole map would be Democrat for 2 cycles. And then the Republicans, having no choice, would just shift to the left, right? And that's shown in country after country across the world. You can move the Overton window so that even though you think one thing is wrong, over generations you can change views. And even though what's right wing in one generation may not be right wing in the next generation, and same for left wing. Things can move both ways. But unfortunately, in the society we've had over the past 100 years or so, things tend to move to the left, not to the right.
I don't share your optimism at all. I can't see that happening.
Okay, so you just think a complete breakdown of the union.
I think that the scenario that's going to happen, if we continue down the path that we have right now,
Yes.
is we're going to have candidates that will always be chosen based on their adherence to a particular narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter whether you happen to be Republican or Democrat. But if, as long as you're prepared to actually slot yourself into that particular box, you will get a seat at the table. And that's pretty much the way in which the U.S. has run.
Yeah, it's. I think I'm not describing the person. I'm describing the box.
Yes.
And I'm just saying that in California, a Republican is a Texas Democrat, and in Texas, a Democrat is a California Republican, and so just by seeing that, that differential. And I'm sure, we can see these differences.
But you do know that the Democrat head of the California State Senate,
Kevin Kiley, I think it is.
No, it was a woman, and she switched sides, and she's now declared herself to be an independent, and she's endorsed Trump.
Okay, I mean, you will find interesting
Yes.
examples.
So what
like
I'm
that.
saying
you
is
can
that
find it on. You can find it in the
what I'm
presidential race.
what I'm saying is that your generalization in
Kevin
this
Kiley
particular
now.
case doesn't really matter. But crucially, because I think we need to move past the elections. So from my side, I'm saying
Yeah.
I'm not calling it simply based on the fact if it was a free and fair election, it's very clear to me that Trump would win.
Yeah.
Okay, as things stand right now, a lot of it is going to depend.
No, I don't want to get to the Trump will win part yet. Let's get there at the end of the podcast because there's more to discuss.
So you want to spend the entire podcast talking about Trump? Okay, that's cool.
Not what I want to. We can spend the whole thing on this particular election and the shenanigans around it and all the issues. But sure, let me not stop your train of thought on So you're saying he should win? Why should he win?
Simply,
Because if someone's let's try sort of steelman the opposing argument. Because if I go out into the South African public and I say Trump should
so
win
the direct
American
correlation that I will draw is the first U.S. election that I really had a chance to observe, which was the contest between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look in terms of all of the factors that led to Jimmy Carter being ousted as president, and remember that Reagan's victory at that point was resounding. I mean, almost the entire map of the U.S. turned red.
Yes.
And
Or white, blue, actually, because they were using the color blue for Reagan at that point.
you may
I
be
will show
correct.
you- I
You
will
may
show
be
you
correct.
evidence.
But again, let's not get bogged down by the semantics of that. But the crucial thing is at that particular time, all of the economic factors
Yes.
that afflicted the U.S. under the Carter administration currently exist.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. High
so
inflation.
you had extremely high inflation. You had runaway fuel prices. You had people.
High food prices.
Yeah. So high. Yeah. But
Cost of living.
Yeah. Cost of living. All of those things. But soaring debt. So all of the indicators that showed that there was an overwhelming dissatisfaction by the majority of people with the economy of the country, and as a direct result of that, Reagan got elected. Now you ask yourself, what is different about the current scenario? Because Biden has pretty much done everything that Carter did back then. He's run the economy into the ground. And let's not use the stock market as an indicator of what's actually going on, because that's not a fair comparison. Look, I'm very happy with the performance of the stock market, and the reason why the stock market has performed very clearly is because there was so much stimulus that was injected into the economy, and all that money had to go somewhere. And thank goodness it's pushed up the stock market. And yes, my portfolio is very happy with that. Thank you very much. But the majority of people on the ground, it's not different to them compared to what happened during Carter's time. So just simply based on that.
Even just let me say on the stock market, fine, you say, the stocks that you have gone up and you are on paper, wealthier. But has your life improved? Has your life day to day improved because that is the situation? I would argue probably not, because even if you're invested in stocks.
So that's a different argument, because remember that I invest in stocks not on the basis of my wanting to draw upon them for a source of revenue.
It's for one day.
Exactly. So, but the crucial thing to understand is that for the majority of the people in the United States, the movements, whether the stock market goes up or down, doesn't affect them at any fundamental level other than how it's going to affect their pension funds.
Yeah.
But most people, in fact, end up not thinking about that.
That's right. So, but I think it's a valid point to the argument. You're saying it's another argument, but I think it's valid in just to say that even if your pension has gone up and you're gonna have an extra $10,000 when you retire.
Correct. Yeah.
That doesn't help you buy carrots that have doubled in price at the grocery store today. That changes nothing in terms of how you live now as a 50-year-old, for example.
Yes.
And so I think that's important because, citing the stock market, Trump does it as well. And I always think it's cool to say, the stock market's doing well under me. But it's like, what is the person on the ground earning a salary, having to buy food, pay rent or a mortgage or a bond? What are the real everyday things? How do those impact people? And so the stock market doesn't tend to impact those people unless the stock market growth is related to those companies particularly growing and employing people, pumping more money into the economy. Now, because of globalism, that doesn't happen. A separate discussion. But yeah, do carry on, on that point.
So if you use that as the very simple comparison, you draw a comparison between the Carter era and the current Biden administration. By every bit of logic that we can apply to it, exactly the same situation should apply. Because the promises that Trump is making at this point are completely along the lines of what Reagan promised at the time, and in fact, to a large extent, implemented at the time, which was to basically, set the economy free, slash the cost of energy, and remember that that Carter's fall was really provoked to a large extent by the soaring oil prices that came about as a direct result of what went down in Libya at the time. So you ask me why I think Trump should be winning. It's simply because that everything that he's got in terms of his policy positions right now directly addresses all of the pain that's being felt by the majority of voters in the country.
Okay.
Irrespective of whatever their stance might be in terms of things like abortion, for example, or trans rights as another example. Are they all united in the fact that the amount of food that they can buy on a monthly basis is actually declining while their earnings are not going up? And the answer to that, yes. Is it also true that you have enough people who remember that real wages went up for Americans for the first time in decades under Donald Trump?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is yes. So that's the short answer in terms of why I think Trump should be winning. And for exactly the same reason, Harris should not be in any way a contender, simply because she's going to be continuing implementation of exactly the policies that exist right now that are driving people further into poverty on a daily basis.
All right. I agree with you. I think anyone who's listened to us for long enough knows. I'm an ardent Trump supporter. I'm not embarrassed about that at all.
But again, John,
I'll try to give as an objective.
But John, I think one of the issues is that when we talk about stuff like, ardent Trump supporter, it actually tends to muddy the waters, because this is not about whether or not you support Trump. It's a question of whose policies actually make the most sense.
Yeah, but how do I get to being a supporter?
But when I say...
I didn't just look at the guy and go, I like how he looks, or I like the fact that he wears a red cap.
Yeah, you see, the question then becomes... if there happened to be a person who was ticking all of the boxes that Trump is currently ticking, but had a far more likable personality in the sense that he wasn't being as outwardly condescending to stupid people as he is. I think that at that point you would then say, well, if I'm looking at these two and, all things else being equal, I'm going to...
I don't think that is true. And I'll give you some, recent history in that regard. So George Bush Jr. Was decried as being an absolute moron.
W.
He wasn't. He's not the smartest guy to ever occupy the office, but not the dumbest either.
He was drunk most of the time.
I don't agree with that either. But the point is that he was decried as a terrible human being. You can go back to the reporting from the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the usual suspects. He was decried as a terrible... I'm not making a defense. I'm not a George W. Bush
he was decried as a terrible
fan.
What?
He was decried as a terrible human being overall. Okay, and that's before the Iraq War. So let's move that away from this is but while he was running. This is when in his first year. This was the criticism he received was particularly unfair. Okay, but let's go to someone that's not as controversial. Let's go to John McCain. Right, John McCain was who now is a hero to the left, absolute hero. Was completely destroyed in his, or they attempted to completely destroy him in his campaign against Obama. They called him all kinds of terrible things. Mitt Romney is the most milquetoast human being you will ever find. There is nothing interesting or disinteresting about the man. He just exists. He's almost like a human tree. Okay? He breathes in oxygen and breathes out carbon dioxide. Yes, trees do that half the day. There's nothing exciting. And he was a terrible misogynist. He was decried as a complete misogynist because they asked him, who are you going to appoint into your cabinet, and into your administration? And he said, no, look, I've got binders full of women's CVs. And binders full of women, go Google it, became a massive thing. It basically tanked his campaign. Okay. Some news outlets called Mitt Romney Hitler. Some news outlets called George W. Bush Hitler. Some news outlets called Donald Trump Hitler. It doesn't change. It doesn't matter whether you're a nice person or not. It doesn't matter whether you present well. It doesn't matter whether you're nice to dumb people. It doesn't matter whether you send good tweets or mean tweets. It makes no difference. If you're on that side of the ticket, right, you will never get a fair shot. Trump knows that. That's why he doesn't give two shits. That's why he behaves like he does. That's why when he gets their advice not to behave like that, he ignores it. Because his view is, you want to come at me? I'm going to go at you. That's how he views the world. It's how he grew up, essentially. Being in New York, where that's kind of a New Yorker type of attitude. It's Goodfellas. You want to go at me? It's that thing. It's that whole thing. So the thing is Trump's never going to get a fair shake. And I'm not an ardent Trump supporter because I'm trying to be counter narrative or counter revolutionary, or because I'm trying to shake the table or anything. I like Trump because of the things Trump did while he was in office. I like the things he said he was going to do when he campaigned. And when he got into office, he did good things. And the problem is a lot of that stuff isn't reported on, but there's broad stuff that can be seen. The number of wars globally that were occurring when Trump left office is the lowest number of armed conflicts in human history since that has been recorded. Okay? That's a good thing. That's a good thing. You can believe that.
Well, it's the first time since World War II that the US didn't get into
a new armed conflict. And withdrew from others.
Yes.
Okay. You can believe that Trump and Putin hold hands and go on swings when they go to Camp David to have talks or whatever. I don't care. You can believe they're best friends. The reality is that Putin felt brave enough to move into Crimea under Obama, and he felt brave enough to move into Ukraine under Biden. He didn't move a frickin' inch under Trump. That's just a reality. Those are facts.
But at the same time, let's be very clear. that Trump was not going to be posing an existential threat to Putin. So the one thing that Trump is very clear about is that based on his policy, which is to put Americans first, he is not going to be spending resources
putting weapons on Putin's border.
Exactly.
I agree with you.
And it's really that fundamental.
On the existential threat.
Because let's be very clear. Trump has shown that he has the ability to be tough on stuff. And
on the existential threat, he
yes.
threatened Putin.
Yes.
He said to him,
yes.
He said to him, listen, you put 1 foot, according to Trump, he said this, but according to people who were in the room, this occurred. He said to Trump, he said to Putin, if you put 1 foot into Ukraine, I'm going to bomb Moscow. And Putin said to him, no, you won't. And he said, try me. Now,
so
that is an existential threat, but it's a threat of saying, look, I'm not going to come for you, but you also aren't going to come for me.
Correct.
And if we both understand where we stand and what's acceptable to both of us, we're good. So and that's you know, that's the whole peace through strength.
Yes.
Right? You have to project an image of strength. I will not tolerate this. And I'm telling you now.
So along the same lines, take the view that Lil Kim across in Korea.
Rocket Man.
Yes. So there were no missile launches after his meeting with
correct
with Trump. It was an amicable meeting. Trump was the first and only American leader to actually cross into North Korea, admittedly in the demilitarized zone, and it was very clear that there was a mutual respect that actually kicked in at that point. Was Trump effective in terms of minimizing an ongoing arms race that was happening between the North and South in that part? Absolutely.
And furthermore, breaking up to an extent China's power. So, you know, Trump's understanding of China's role in the world, I agree with, I identify with. I think he realizes that you don't want to make China any stronger than they are. And China has their own agenda and their own things they're going to do. But you don't want to, for example, drive Russia, a superpower with a lot of nuclear weapons, into China's arms, which is what has happened during the Biden administration with sanctions on MasterCard and Visa, for example, and all the brands and everything. And now they're just in bed with China and selling oil to China and doing just as well as they were before. You know, these are world peace is an example. That actually affects me as a South African. It matters to me if people start lobbing nuclear weapons at each other, because I can weather most things, but I'm probably unable to weather a global nuclear war were it to occur. Okay? And the chances of it, I still think are not very high, but they're not off the radar at the moment. And that's concerning. You know, the other things Trump did during his presidency was he deregulated a lot of the American economy, which enabled business and the economy to fly. Now, when the American economy does well, because of the sheer power and momentum of the American economy, in general, the world tends to do better. Right? Now, we may have some problems around exchange rates, for example, but for the most part, the global money supply improves. The amount of money flowing through economies, not just in America, because America is not an island.
So we could spend lots of time actually talking about.
What I'm saying is
you're essentially taking the John Mearsheimer argument, which is that it is in America's interest to prevent a situation where China's economy is able to grow to the same level that America's economy is, and more to the point, to overtake America's economy. And the only way that you can do that is by undermining the free market. And the issue right now in terms of...
I completely disagree with what you're saying. So I'm not on the John Mearsheimer page. I listened to John recently.
Yes. So, and let me explain why that's the case. You either take the view that you have a free market that's actually going to...
What free market, Kanthan?
Yeah.
Just explain which free market you're talking about.
So we can... so
it doesn't exist.
Yeah. So if you use that as a starting point, then you need to then backtrack and say, it's in everyone's interest to ensure that no one else is able to actually reach to the same level that they currently have.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, with regards to economics and China and America and all that, And I made this point quite a long time ago on a podcast we did with Herman Pretorius from the IRR, who was very pro-China and didn't give a shit about any of their issues, seemingly in that podcast. But go listen to it and see if that's correct.
So,
however, the point is, my point is this: there is no free market. If you could have a true free market, I am absolutely 100% down. Right? And if China could be as successful and as big as they are with a true free market, then that's fine. And if China were to grow into the world's greatest superpower,
but John, I do think that you have a particular set of blinkers when it comes to China, and we've talked about that in the past. But let's pull this back to the whole question of U.S. policy and in terms of Trump's standpoint in particular. So the thing that I did agree with in terms of what Trump did was to use tariffs. And I think the use of tariffs is a good way to reconcile the basic core idea of free markets,
which I'll note Biden has mainly kept
with national interest. And, so national interest basically means that you don't want a scenario where you are buying from the cheapest possible source at the expense of undermining your country's ability to stand on its own feet in the long term.
That's right. So you've spoken about like textiles in this country as an
Yes.
example. Right. So, I don't want to get too much. We can get into China. Maybe we do China another time because you and I disagree on China. But those were all. Those were a lot of positives of Trump's time in office. A lot of good stuff that happened there. There's a whole list of other stuff that really, if people are interested, I suppose I can post sometime, or we can briefly talk about it again on the podcast. But that's why he should win. And mostly, it's something Roseanne Barr posted a while back, is that this election is an IQ test. For me, it's very simple that as an American and for the world was a better place in 2019 than it is, and a safer place than it is in 2024. And I credit some of that, a fair amount of it, to Trump being in office. And obviously all the people underneath him being in office and doing the things they did, the Abraham Accords, as an example. The absolute dumpster fire that is the Middle East right now did not exist in 2019, and nor do I believe it would have, nor do I believe will it, should Trump come to office. I think that will be resolved in roughly a year. Okay?
But you're actually getting to the crucial points, because the reason why we are so invested in the idea of who actually ends up taking over the United States, we do know that if Trump gets into office, there will be resolution to the Middle East.
And the Ukraine-Russia war.
There will be resolution to the Ukraine-Russia war. There will be a pullback in terms of the way in which the Taiwan versus mainland China conflict is currently being handled. And if you can immediately address just those things, the knock-on impact in terms of the world's economy is immediately going to be prosperity.
And the Houthis will stop. They will deal with the Houthis in Yemen, and that means that shipping will be able to easily run through the straits again. And so suddenly, a whole bunch of things will drop in price. Not only that, the oil price will come down again, because Trump has said that his biggest priority for reducing the cost of living in the United States is to bring down the energy costs, because energy costs inform everything else, as we discussed last week. And so if he does that, he makes America again a net exporter of energy, mainly oil and gas. And so what that does is OPEC becomes not the monopoly that they are, the cartel that they are. They become a player in the global industry. And so we see petrol prices again, oil prices dropping. And so there's just so much potential benefit there in terms of what could happen globally. And look, I like America as a country. I think that there's a lot of positive things that America gives the world in terms of what it shows about a country that is based on liberty and freedom.
Or used to be.
Sure, but its foundational principles are liberty and freedom. And every country, every democracy since then has tried to replicate that same thing, to a lesser or greater extent. And they're the original experiment. And I don't want them to fail. I just don't want them to fail. I think it's very, very important for humanity that they don't. You know, this has been really, the American experiment has been a golden age of humanity. Everything is better for mankind. Now, I'm not saying this just comes down to America. Other countries, other peoples have contributed tons to the development of mankind. But where we are, where the world is now compared to where it was in 1776, is a far better life for the average human on Earth. And it constantly improves. And America has had a major role to play in that. And so it would be potentially devastating to humanity for that experiment to end. And so I don't want it to end. And, you know, if you're a Harris supporter, if you want Kamala to win, you know, everything she does is more of, so she literally copied and pasted her policies. We don't really fully know how she wants to implement them because she won't say. So she was on 60 Minutes. Go watch the full interview, not the edited one, the full interview. Go watch it. She has no idea how she's going to implement her economic policy. Her economic policy is something called an opportunity economy, which she says everyone needs to have the same opportunities, which is kind of an old liberal trope, you know, same opportunities, not same outcome, except she says that everyone needs to end up in the same place. She keeps using that language. So she wants the same opportunities and the same outcomes. Now, that's communism. You can't do that. So she can't explain that. Her foreign policy is atrocious.
You say she can't do that, and I'm saying that she will do that.
Oh, she will, and she will break it. She'll break the system. And I'm just saying I really don't want that to occur. Trump should win. At minimum, it's an IQ test, as Roseanne Barr says.
So again, I agree with that analogy if the elections were free and fair.
Yeah, right.
And
so we get back to these problems with their elections.
You can't conflate those two.
Maybe just to finish it up, do you think there's been enough or any movement that might prevent that skullduggery that's occurred in their elections
from
actually impacting it?
There's lots of stuff that's been happening at that level. The one is that there's a significant body of Republican volunteers that are going to be on the ground at a number of these crucial polling districts in order to monitor it more closely. Certainly the legal teams are significantly better briefed this time round than they were previously. You're also not conducting this election against the backdrop of the all of the restrictions that were put in place around based on COVID at the time. And I think that you can also take the view that the scrutiny of the mail-in ballots this time around and signature verification is going to be a lot more firmly enforced. Okay. So if you just use those as the very basic criteria, I think that it's going to be far more difficult this time round for elections to be as blatantly manipulated as they were last time round. So, but having said that, we do have the wild cards in terms of all of the undocumented illegal immigrants that are in the country, and whether they will end up voting in those particular voting districts. Are you then likely to have a scenario where you have votes that are significantly larger than the number of registered voters that you actually have in that district? Yes, but how do you end up policing that stuff and preventing those votes from being counted? This is something that I keep telling people with regard to the 2020 elections. You have to understand that it's possible for me to say that Biden is a legitimate president.
Yes.
Because the process by which he got in was legitimate.
Correct.
At the same time, do I believe that there was skullduggery?
He won the election.
Yes.
And then he was certified, and then he was sworn in.
Exactly.
If I go stand on that stage, at that inaugural stage that everyone knows with the Capitol in the background, if I go stand on that stage and put my hand on the Bible and in front of the Supreme Court Justice swear to the oath of office, I will also be the legitimate president, assuming I'm an American citizen and assuming I've ticked all the boxes. Mm-hmm. But that's not the point.
Yes. So the point is the process that actually happened before that time, and look, understand that when I take this view around rigging of the process, it's also the rigging of the process to ensure that people who, to my mind, are far more competent than Harris were deliberately excluded from the polling process. So you take RFK Jr. as an example, Marianne Williamson as another example.
This is the only time I'll stick up for Gavin Newsom. But frankly, Gavin Newsom was excluded because when Biden stepped down, I'll remind everyone, we still do not know what actually happened. Biden released an official letter on a letterhead, which was abnormal because it wasn't the presidential letterhead, and
it was released on Twitter.
And it was released only on Twitter, and it has his signature, which was a signature that it looked like his, but there was a part of it that he's never used before. So it was irregular. But he released a letter, and the letter said, look, I'm stepping down, and I'm going to and you can go find the letter, I'm going to let the Democratic Party handle how they go forward. I think we should have some sort of process. Okay? Yes. It doesn't say what process that is, but it says we should have a process. 40 minutes later, he sends out another tweet which goes, I'm endorsing Kamala Harris. Now, it's unclear who sent the letter, who sent the tweets.
Well, who controlled his Twitter account?
Because
he certainly wasn't the person controlling his
The
own
week
Twitter
before he sent the letter, there was a whole talk by Obama and other seniors in that party about how they were going to handle it. And the idea was that they were actually going to go to the Democratic National Convention, and they're going to have a bit of a runoff at the convention with the delegates voting. And, Gavin Newsom probably would have come out. Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro, there's a few options, would have come out as the candidate. And they also had it stolen from them, frankly. This process has not been fair. Bernie Sanders, I'm not a fan at all. But Bernie Sanders has been screwed out of the Democratic vote, it being the head of the ticket, twice now. He was screwed over in 2016 by Donna Brazil. Go Google it.
Yes, and again in 2020. Mm-hmm.
And again in 2020, when Pete Buttigieg and that whole crew clubbed behind Biden in return for cabinet positions. And so, and that was a coup. And they keep doing these coup things. I think the whole process has been, that's why the IQ test comment works so much for me. Because if as an American you look at this and you say to yourself, despite all of the stuff that's gone on, despite my life objectively being worse, food is much more expensive to buy, my salary just doesn't go as far, the country doesn't seem to be doing as well, there's a very good chance if I have a male son, they're going to be going to war in the next 5 years, and it could be a nuclear war, which means we might all die. All of these things are not unreasonable things to state as relatively factual. The nuclear stuff is opinion, obviously, but the war stuff, I don't think that's opinion. I think it's evident that we're heading towards a global escalation as things stand. And certainly the way life is for an American and for the rest of the world is harder now than it was. And so you have to then go and vote for someone who was the least popular vice president in history, according to polling, the very polling that says she's winning.
0 votes in the primaries.
And who won 0 votes in the primaries, and who rose to this position nobody knows how, and who has these crazy ideas of what she wants to do with the country, or no idea what she wants to do. Either they're terrible ideas or she's clueless. She cannot speak in a normal interview like a normal human being. She constantly says things like, Americans have hopes and dreams and ambitions, but it doesn't answer the actual questions she's been asked. It's sort of this very fluffy language which says nothing and goes nowhere. If they still vote for her, assuming a free and fair election, but if they still are going to put someone like that into office, they deserve what they get. Is that fair? I mean, in a free and fair system, yes. In a non-free and fair system, what do you say?
There's an interesting phenomenon that I've noticed, and I have an interesting control group. Now, some of our audience might be aware of the fact that I ended up doing high school in India. And and it was an interesting time because I ended up going to boarding school in India because it was 1974 and things like the Frelimo rally were happening, and my mom was basically convinced that I would get involved in student politics, and
She was right.
She was right to some extent, but I ended up going to high school in India, and look, it happened to be a very good high school, and so the net result is that now, close on 45 years later, after my graduating class, a lot of my classmates ended up in the United States and in very good positions, primarily in the tech industry. And we have a very active class WhatsApp group. Okay, so there's roughly about 60 of us that are still around and on that WhatsApp group. And the fascinating thing is that, so you've got this sample of people across multiple countries, and those of us who live in the United States, fascinating that they are so firmly vested in the idea of a Kamala Harris presidency. And the levels of enthusiasm and the levels of the fawning hagiography that you see on the part of my classmates versus those of us who live in other parts of the world. And, obviously, the majority of my classmates happen to be from India, and whose views in terms of Harris are very much shaped by the impact of what a Harris presidency is likely to have in terms of geopolitics.
Yeah.
And so you have in the US right now, and I keep making this reference to the concept of the laptop class.
Yeah.
And these are people who essentially live very comfortable lives in the United States. They have very well-paying jobs. Most of the time, they're living in homes that are in areas that don't they have access-controlled areas, so they're gated communities, and when they travel, it's generally within the confines of those communities, or they are traveling outside of the country for whatever reason. There is hardly any need for them to be walking in downtown San Francisco, as an example.
Yeah.
And tripping over excrement and tents and all of that kind of stuff that happens to be on the streets. And the essential divide that you have right now in the U.S. is between those classes. And the classes that have benefited from the tech economy and from being part of the intellectual economy are very much going to continue voting for the Democratic establishment.
Until when? What breaks them?
Well, what's going to break them at the point at which it becomes personal? And it hasn't become personal for them yet. You see, when their lifestyle actually gets affected to the level that it's going to make a meaningful difference. Until then, it's not going to happen. So what I'm saying is that using the IQ test is not necessarily the thing. I think it's we need to take the view cognitive dissonance is real. And when people are so vested in the existing system because of the fact that they benefit from it as much as they do, there is nothing that will make them change their mind.
What is, maybe just to ask, what is appealing to those friends on that WhatsApp group who would or are going to vote for Harris? What is it that they like about her? Or is it only what they don't like about Trump?
It's mostly what they don't like about Trump.
Okay. And what is it? Is it mostly personality things they don't like about Trump?
So whenever you ask a question around what Harris's policy is going to be, or even to the extent of what could Biden be doing right now that's better, well, they'd say, well, the economy is bad, but at least it's not as bad as it would be if Trump were in charge, because you know what he's going to do? He's going to rip apart the fabric of society. He's going to polarize the society, and we're going to be having fighting on the streets. In fact, everything that happened under the Biden administration, with the likes of the BLM protests and just the rampant riots that have taken place across the board.
Yeah.
But again, it's because they are not exposed to it at the level of it impacting on their lives on a daily basis.
Yeah. All right, Kanthan, I think that's enough. We've given everyone quite a long podcast on what we think will happen. I don't know, to just say. I think, as you said, impossible to predict. I can't say. I think Trump should win. I even think based on support he should win. I think based on logic he should win. But if there's shenanigans going on and elections aren't necessarily free and fair, I don't know. And if you only need to swing a swing state by 20,000 votes, 20,000 pieces of paper is not a hard thing to do,
yes.
Especially when you have the system designed for that exact purpose. There is, some people talk about something called the margin of cheating, which is to say, okay, it takes 40,000 votes, maybe 20 to 40,000 votes to swing a swing state. So if Trump wins by 300,000 votes in that swing state, then no amount of cheating you can overcome the cheating, essentially. And I think that may be true. And perhaps if turnout is incredible and, Republican/Trump voters, because I think they're different things now, but the people who are going to vote for Trump go out in massive numbers, you may see a blowout election. You may see him win the popular vote. Very unlikely, but you might see it. And you may see him win all of the swing states. But that said, we don't have any precedent for that other than maybe Reagan. But that was a very different election with very different candidates. Carter and Mondale both were not disliked in the same kind of way. Carter is probably the more accurate example as you gave, but he wasn't hated as a person. And Reagan was liked, but he wasn't before that. He wasn't necessarily he was liked. He was popular, but he wasn't loved in any kind of way. So there are similarities. They're not direct, and so it's very difficult to predict who's going to win. And we'll have to see. We've got 3 weeks to wait, and whatever happens, I think we will be fine on our little southern tip here. I do think that renaming major roads in front of embassies after terrorists will be a very negative career move for some politicians in this country. Should Trump win?
Look, I don't have any issue with them renaming streets after terrorists. I do have a problem with them renaming Santon Drive. Because Santon Drive, it's a geographic name. Idiots. Just understand, it literally defines the area. It's called Santon Drive. You want to go rename something after Leila Khaled, go rename Grayston Drive. I don't give a shit who Grayston is. Okay, go rename Grayston Drive to Leila Khaled Drive. I don't care. But Santon Drive, the area is Santon. It is the Manhattan of Africa. Yeah. Don't do stupid shit. It's like going to rename Cape Town. It's iconic. People come to Santon from across this continent.
Yes.
It's the biggest draw card in terms of tourism in South Africa because of all of the wealthy people who flock to Santon to do shopping.
Yes,
Get a grip.
And now to do business. My opinion on it obviously is, as I've said, I think it's completely silly to rename. I think it's silly to rename anything, by the way. My position on renaming of things is that nothing should be renamed.
Well, I feel strongly about this one, not because it's Leila Khaled, but because I think it's stupid.
Let me give you my full thing. So my belief is you should build things. If you want to name things, you should build them. Okay?
Yes.
So you don't get to name something you didn't build. If you build something and then want to change the name, not a problem. But you didn't build it, so you don't get to name it. So as far as politicians go...
Exactly. So we built the Nelson Mandela Bridge.
And we named it the Nelson Mandela Bridge.
And we named it the Nelson Mandela Bridge. And it's right next to the Queen Elizabeth Bridge.
That's correct.
Yes.
And that's my position on naming things. How about build instead of trying to steal other people's glory? That's one. The second thing on the Leila Khaled, I obviously have all the same kind of positions everyone has on the... Why are you naming it after a terrorist? She's kind of an odious human being and all of the rest of that. But I think it's incredibly... What I think hasn't been said is that it's incredibly insulting to the Muslim community. I think it's obviously insulting to the Americans. That's why they want to do it there.
Oh, I don't know. I don't assume, kind of collective hurt upon the Muslim community based on this.
Let me just expand. You could name it Ahmed Kathrada Drive if you really wanted to rename it. He's a well-known Muslim who did some good things. I'm not the biggest fan, to be frank, but I think there's a fair argument to be made that he was a good guy, and he did a lot, and he has had roads named after him in this country. So you could do that. There's none in Joburg, to my knowledge, named after him. You could do that. There are other.
But you're fully aware of the fact that they're renaming this particular street
to piss off the Americans.
To piss off the Americans, because number one, Santon Drive.
I'm well aware of that.
Yes,
and all I'm pointing out is that, and I hear you about collective grouping of anything. And I'm sure there are some Muslims who are pro this and some who are anti. I don't know. I haven't spoken to many about it. All I'm saying is it seems quite insulting to me that one is to piss off the Americans, but I think there's another part of it which is to curry favor with the Muslim community, which the ANC very much tried to do.
No, not at all. No, they certainly don't give a shit about the Muslim community at any level.
Well, they're pretending to.
And more to the point, the Muslim community doesn't really give a shit about them either.
Okay.
Yeah.
They certainly are pretending to. And they made a lot of moves like this. This was proposed before the elections, by the way.
Yes, very much so.
To a Muslim community. So to say it's got nothing and they're completely disconnected, I think is
I'm saying that it's not going to be one of those things that's...
I'm not saying...
And also recognize that this is a microcosm of the conflict that's
you're
playing
missing
out.
the point. I'm not saying the Muslims are stupid enough to be bought by a road name for a person who's not even part of their community. What I'm saying is that you have people pandering, and I think it's quite insulting to that community to believe that you can, number one, pander to them, but number two, that the way to pander to them is to rather than take someone from their community who's contributed a lot to the South African environment, to the South African society, rather than to do that and to honor that person, whoever that may be, and there's many of them.
Well, as an example, I was part of the campaign to take the road that that crosses the N12, that links Soweto and Lenasia to Abu Aswad Drive.
Okay.
And we fought for a number of years to get that in place. And the reason for that is, my personal interest in that was Abu Aswad was a dear friend who was murdered by Winnie Mandela's thugs. Let's put that on record as well. And it was a road that didn't have a name, and we ended up getting it renamed to Abu Aswad Drive. And it's to your point of actually building new things that are going to make a difference to us. And again,
he was someone who made a contribution, right?
Look, people are going to be renaming roads after people simply because of the fact that whoever happens to be in place at the time has this idea that it's a good thing to do.
Yes.
And I'm going to reiterate my point. I don't care about stuff getting renamed, but renaming geographic names is really stupid. For example, in Durban, there's this entire concept of the Bria, which is this ridge that stretches across all of Durban, surrounding the city. And at the topmost part of the ridge, the road was called South Ridge Road, and North Ridge Road. And all of these were broken up and given different names. So one of them is called Peter Mokaba Road. And it makes absolutely no sense. You're taking something that's actually geographically accurate and telling people the logistics of where you want to be. So if you say South Ridge Road, you immediately get a sense.
Where on the ridge you want to be.
Yes, yeah. Again, for the same reason, we have this thing in Johannesburg called Main Reef Road.
Yes.
Now, you understand immediately it is following the path
of the reef.
Of the reef.
Absolutely.
And you do not want to go and rename stuff like that. By all means, take a road like Grayston Drive. I don't care who Grayston was. You want to rename Grayston Drive, go ahead. But for God's sake, don't mess with the geographic stuff. It's just stupid.
Yeah, as I say, I would only do it on built stuff because if you take the policy of we can just rename whenever we want, someone gave a shit who Grayston was, right, at some point. But they're no longer around or in power.
But also people must remember that
you can just do this ad infinitum.
Yeah, but the historic precedent people should remember okay, is that in the 19th century, okay, the city was called St. Petersburg. And then the commies came into power and they renamed it to Leningrad. And at the point at which the commies were ousted from power, what's the first thing that the people did? They changed the name back to St. Petersburg. Yeah. So, I remain hopeful that at some point sanity will prevail.
Whoever's in power
yes.
has that power. And so, it's the same thing with any legislation you pass. I mean, some of the legislation we have, it's just amazing to think. I sometimes sort of thought experiment this. You look at some of our legislation, you go, sure, some bad people I don't like, so I consider them to be bad people, and I think some of the things they've done are bad. But some bad people, from my perspective, have put in place these laws, and these laws are really terrible. What would happen if I got into power and I could use the same laws against them? And that, and that's the real problem with legislation is every single legislative move. The question should always be, before it can even be put on the table, should be, what if my worst enemy was able to utilize this law? What would I be happy with this law?
Every single bit of legislation should be passed through that filter.
Absolutely.
And, yeah.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so, and you just assume, because we are very small-minded creatures, we can't really think that far ahead. Most people don't think very far ahead, but even if you force people and you say, look, I want you to think far into the future, what might happen, most people can't meld the reality into a completely opposite reality. So, I imagine if you had taken someone in the 50s, an Afrikaner who was very pro the NP, and said he was for the Nats and he was very pro everything they were doing, and you said, dude, can you imagine if some of the stuff was used against you? What if, it wasn't the white dudes in power, it was the black dudes in power? And then, what if they used the exact same laws in reverse?
Exactly. What if they were suddenly using race as a criteria to keep you out of universities or to keep you out of medical school?
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure he would not have been able to perceive of that.
Exactly.
And you see it globally. It's not just a South African thing. It's easy with our past and such black and white, excuse the pun, I guess, black and white thinking. But you see it all over the show. You wonder if the Republicans, if Trump were to win, and he now takes some of these laws and executive orders even that have been put in place by the Biden-Harris administration or Obama or other presidencies before him or other Congresses, and he goes, let's use that, but let's use it against my enemies. So I wonder if Kamala Harris has ever done a bookkeeping error in which she paid someone but then didn't declare it. I wonder if she did that, and we can maybe take her to court.
Warren was ever guilty of. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, this is the point, right? It's all.
You're familiar with the Nancy Pelosi stock track.
It's just incredible. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely. The only problem I have with it is just to give everyone some background. So Nancy Pelosi is worth somewhere in the region of $150 to $200 million. But she's been in Congress for 40 years, I think. But if you take her salary over that time, even with smart investing, that normal people like us would do, you would never make up $150 to $200 million in wealth. So she's obviously either taken money from lobbyists, which she probably has, but also what they noticed is that she has a large stock portfolio, as does her husband. And she keeps making perfect trades. So, for example, before NVIDIA goes through the roof to $900 a share or whatever it was, she buys it at $150, right? And then but she buys it a few weeks before it starts its rally. So she makes hundreds of percents in profit, but she keeps doing that with multiple stocks over years. So she's made a lot of money. She's probably the world's most successful stock trader, which is hilarious because obviously Nancy Pelosi isn't smart enough to be the world's best stock trader. But what's happening is, and this isn't just her, there's a whole track of Congress people in Congress, Republicans and Democrats. So it's bipartisan. And who are all very good stock traders, who all sort of blow through the market. So if you're quite good, or you give your money to a company who trades stocks, in a good year you probably get a 15 to 20% return. That's a good year In a bad year, you'll basically beat inflation. If you're lucky, so 6-7% after fees, you'll probably lose, right? So these guys are making 30, 40, sometimes 80, 90, 100% on their trades. So it's not possible. So someone has been tracking, and there's an X account where they track Nancy Pelosi's trades of her stock portfolio. The only problem I have with it is that the Congress people, I think, only declare once every quarter.
Yes, so you're always behind the curve.
You
and
can't fully
use it.
exactly.
Yes,
but there's sort of evidence that she'll have meetings with certain like leaders or certain companies and whatever, know that they're going to do something big in the next couple of months, and then buy their stock, and then obviously make a shitload of cash, which is just amazing, unbelievable, and it's pure corruption. I mean, that's insider trading, right? You and I would go to prison for that, or at minimum get a massive fine. So, yeah, such is the way of the world. Kanthan?
So we'll call it?
We will call it. Thank you so much. I hope everyone found that useful. I know not everyone loves the American politics.
Well, you did get requests for us to go into it. And,
we did get quite a few. And
we didn't have time to talk about Lesotho, and we didn't have time to talk about the DA, and we didn't have time to talk about whether or not the 4.5 earthquake in Iran was an underground nuclear test.
Yes. Or any of the hurricane stuff in the US, and the crazy people who think that it's all being manipulated, it's weather control. But we can get into that another time. If you guys really liked any of those suggestions that Kanthan had, Lesotho's not going anywhere. Neither is the ANC or the DA. So we can talk about that anytime. But if you like any of those suggestions or want to suggest anything else for a future podcast, we're more than happy to take it on. I'm sorry we didn't give you an answer about who's going to win the American election. We can't predict that. It should be Trump, but as you heard, both of us don't know based on the actual factors on the ground. Thank you, as always, for listening. We really appreciate it. Or watching. I don't know why anyone chooses to watch us. I suppose you think you're gorgeous.
No, but there are some people who do. Notably, my youngest daughter.
That's all that matters. Thank you, as always. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, do all those wonderful things. Share the podcast, most importantly, with anyone you think who might enjoy it. We obviously seem to be expanding our listenership and viewership over the weeks, except when we say something wrong about climate change, and I'm sure we'll get nailed now.
We didn't say anything wrong about climate change. We did not mention climate change at all. The only thing we did was to suggest that we should be making use of our coal resources. That was it. It had absolutely nothing to do with the merits or demerits of climate change.
We will catch you next time. Thank you so much for listening or watching. Goodbye.